The smell of antiseptic never quite masked the rot beneath. And that's what I remember most about the Imperial Administration Complex on Thyfera, the way everything gleamed white and sterile while corruption festered in every corner, every datapad, every supposedly secure transmission. I was born on Coruscant, in the lower administrative districts where junior bureaucrats raised their families in modest apartments overlooking recycling facilities and transport hubs. And my father taught me early that the Empire ran on two things: fear and paperwork. He was a logistics coordinator for the Imperial Supply Corps, a man who could track a shipment of blaster rifles from Kuat to the Outer Rim with such precision that he once uncovered an entire smuggling operation just by noticing a 3-hour delay in a cargo manifest. He believed in the system, believed that order and efficiency were the foundations of civilization, and when I showed aptitude for data analysis and administrative work, he encouraged me toward a career in imperial governance. I wanted to make him proud. I wanted to be part of something larger than myself, something that brought stability to a galaxy that had nearly torn itself apart during the Clone Wars. I graduated from the Imperial Academy's administrative track at 19, with honors in resource allocation and regional governance, and I received my first posting as an assistant sector analyst on Thyfera, a backwater agricultural world famous for its bacta production and little else. The planet was humid and green, covered in forests and swamps where alaji and kavam plants grew in abundance, and the entire economy revolved around processing those plants into the medical gel that kept the Empire's soldiers alive. It should have been a simple posting: monitor production quotas, ensure tax compliance, file reports with Sector Command. But Thyfera was also located in the Polith system, right at the edge of what was designated as Sector Epsilon 77, a region of 14 inhabited systems so remote and economically insignificant that most Imperial officers considered assignment there a punishment or a dead-end career move. My supervisor was a woman named Alira Ventris, a career administrator in her 50s who'd been managing Epsilon 77's logistics for 12 years. She had sharp eyes behind her wireframe spectacles and a way of reading reports that reminded me of my father. She could spot an inconsistency in seconds, could detect patterns in data that others missed entirely. She took me under her guidance immediately, showing me not just the official procedures but the unofficial realities of governing a remote sector. The Empire's reach is vast, she told me during my first week, standing at the window of our offices overlooking Thyfera's capital. But it's also thin in places like this. We're supposed to maintain order, collect taxes, enforce imperial law, but we're 14 systems with maybe 60 billion combined population, and we get one Star Destroyer patrol every 3 months if we're lucky. Most of the time, we maintain order through the illusion that the Empire is watching, that help is close, that resistance is futile. Remember that, and remember that illusions require constant maintenance. I learned quickly. I processed agricultural reports from Thyfera, mining surveys from Tirius Prime, trade manifests from Kellyan Station. I tracked tax revenue, monitored compliance, filed endless reports with Sector Command on Bestine IV. The work was tedious but satisfying in its precision, its orderliness. Every number had meaning, every data point connected to real resources, real people, real imperial power being projected across the sector. I believed I was maintaining civilization, keeping these remote worlds integrated into the galactic community, ensuring that the chaos of the Clone Wars never returned. Then I started noticing the discrepancies. It began small, minor inconsistencies in production reports from Kellyan Station, a mining facility on the sector's edge that extracted rare metals from asteroid fields. The tonnage numbers didn't quite match transport manifests. Nothing dramatic, just a few percentage points off month after month. I mentioned it to Alira, expecting a simple explanation. Measurement errors, accounting mistakes, the usual friction between theoretical production and actual delivery. She looked at the data for a long time, her expression unreadable, then told me to file it as within acceptable variance and move on to more pressing matters. But I couldn't move on. My father had taught me that small discrepancies were often symptoms of larger problems, that corruption started with minor deviations and grew like disease if left unchecked. I started investigating quietly, cross-referencing Kellyan Station's reports with other data streams, ship manifests, crew rosters, energy consumption logs. The pattern that emerged made my hands shake as I compiled it into a confidential memorandum. Kellyan Station was producing exactly what it claimed, but approximately 15% of that production was being diverted before it reached Imperial inventory. The metals were being loaded onto private transports, vessels registered to a consortium of Thyfera Bacta merchants, and then they vanished from official records. Smuggling, clearly, at a scale that suggested either station management was complicit or they were being extorted. Either way, it was theft from the Empire, a crime punishable by imprisonment or execution, depending on the amount involved. I took my findings to Alira, expecting her to be alarmed, to immediately report this to ISB or Imperial Intelligence. Instead, she read my memorandum in silence, then locked it in her personal safe and told me we needed to talk off the record. We met that evening in her apartment, away from the administration complex's surveillance systems, and she poured me a glass of Corellian whiskey that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "You're right," she said quietly. "The diversion is happening, and it's been happening for years. But before you report this to anyone, you need to understand the full picture." She explained it methodically, using the same data analysis skills she'd taught me. Epsilon 77 was officially designated as a low-priority sector, which meant low military presence, minimal Imperial investment, and governance that was expected to be largely self-sustaining. But self-sustaining meant generating enough local revenue to cover administrative costs, law enforcement, basic infrastructure, and the official tax revenue from 14 poor systems wasn't enough. So a supplementary revenue stream had been quietly established through unofficial arrangements with local businesses. The Bacta merchants paid reduced taxes in exchange for being allowed to smuggle metals through Kellyan Station, selling them on the black market and sharing profits with sector administration. The additional credits were used to maintain order, fund local security forces, and keep the sector functioning without requiring increased Imperial support. "It's corruption," I said, my voice tight. "It's survival," Alira corrected. "The Empire demands we maintain order, but they don't give us the resources to actually do it. So we improvise. We create local arrangements that generate the credits we need to function. And in exchange for looking the other way on some smuggling, we keep 14 systems stable, loyal, and productive. That's the trade-off." "But it's illegal," I insisted. "It violates Imperial law, and if ISB discovers it—" "ISB knows," Alira said flatly. "Or at least they know enough. This isn't unique to Epsilon 77. Half the remote sectors in the Empire operate through similar arrangements. The central authority demands results while providing inadequate resources, so local administrators find creative solutions. As long as we maintain order, as long as the sector remains stable and loyal, no one looks too closely at how we accomplish it." I felt sick. Everything I'd believed about Imperial governance, the pristine efficiency, the uncorrupt administration, the system that my father revered, was built on foundations of pragmatic criminality. The Empire wasn't maintaining order through superior organization. It was tolerating corruption as long as that corruption served imperial interests. "What do I do?" I asked. Alira looked at me with something like sympathy. "You have 3 options. Report this and watch your career end when you're quietly transferred to some posting even more remote than this one, assuming ISB doesn't decide you're a troublemaker who needs to disappear. Accept it and continue doing your job, understanding that sometimes maintaining order requires moral flexibility, or resign and walk away from Imperial service entirely." I chose the second option because I was 20 years old and terrified and still believed, desperately, that I could be part of something good even if the methods were imperfect. I told myself that stable, peaceful systems were worth some corruption, that the greater good justified the compromises. I told myself my father would understand that idealism had to bend to reality. I was a coward and a fool, and I spent the next 3 years proving it. I became complicit in the system Alira had described, processing reports that I knew contained false data, maintaining the official fiction while understanding the unofficial reality. I learned which numbers to question and which to accept without investigation. I learned how to write reports that satisfied Sector Command's requirements while concealing the true nature of our operations. I became skilled at the art of bureaucratic deception, turning corruption into acceptable variance, transforming theft into creative resource allocation. And for a while, it worked. Epsilon 77 remained stable. The 14 systems paid their taxes, maintained order, and stayed loyal to the Empire. We had no rebel activity, no significant crime beyond what we ourselves were facilitating, no problems that required intervention from higher authorities. We were a success story, a remote sector that governed itself efficiently and cost the Empire almost nothing in resources. Then we discovered Kellyan Station was haunted. The report came in routine fashion. 3 miners had disappeared during a standard shift in the asteroid facility's deepest tunnels, the ones that extended into an asteroid the surveys designated as K-77. The station manager initially reported it as an industrial accident, a cave-in that had sealed the miners in an unexplored section. But when the rescue teams cut through to the location, they found no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just 3 mining rigs abandoned mid-operation and a tunnel that extended deeper into the asteroid than any survey had recorded. I wouldn't have paid much attention. Mining accidents were depressingly common, and disappearances in deep space happened, except that 2 weeks later, 4 more miners vanished from the same area, then 6 more. Then an entire shift of 12 workers disappeared over a 3-day period, and the station manager transmitted an emergency request for assistance, claiming that something in the asteroid was taking his people. Alira sent me to investigate personally, along with a squad of local security forces. We took a shuttle from Thyfera to Kellyan Station, a 3-day journey through hyperspace that gave me plenty of time to review the increasingly bizarre reports. Workers claimed to hear voices in the deepest tunnels, whispers that seemed to come from the rock itself. Several miners reported seeing figures in the shadows, human-shaped but wrong somehow, moving in ways that defied physics. Equipment malfunctioned constantly in certain sections, displays showing impossible readings, sensors detecting presences that shouldn't exist. I thought it was psychological, isolation, stress, the paranoia that came from working in deep space for months at a time. But when we arrived at Kellyan Station, and I saw the fear in the station manager's eyes, when I felt the cold dread that permeated the facility's corridors, I understood this was something different. The manager took us to the deepest tunnels, to the section designated K-77, where the disappearances had occurred. The asteroid was ancient, its rock formations predating human spaceflight by millions of years, and as we descended through cramped passages carved by mining equipment, I felt pressure building in my skull, a sensation like being watched by something vast and invisible. The air tasted metallic, sharp, wrong. Our equipment functioned erratically, comm links crackling with static, data pads flickering, lights dimming and brightening without reason. We found the abandoned mining rigs exactly as described, surrounded by tools and equipment that suggested the workers had simply stopped mid-task and walked away. But there were no bodies, no blood, no evidence of violence. Just emptiness and that oppressive sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. One of the security officers activated his scanner to search for life signs, and the device immediately shrieked an alarm. Multiple contacts detected, dozens of them, surrounding us in the tunnels. But when we looked, we saw nothing. No people, no creatures, no explanation for the readings. The scanner kept insisting we were surrounded, kept tracking movements that weren't there, and the security team leader ordered an immediate evacuation. We retreated to the station's operations center, and I transmitted a priority report to Alira. Kellyan Station was experiencing unexplained phenomena that appeared to be claiming personnel, cause unknown, potentially dangerous. I recommended suspending all mining operations in the affected areas until we could determine what was happening. Her response arrived 6 hours later. Continue investigation. Determine if phenomena poses risk to station integrity or only to personnel in affected areas. If risk is contained, quarantine affected sections and maintain production in unaffected areas. Station is critical to sector revenue. Minimize disruption. I stared at that transmission in disbelief. Workers were disappearing. Something inexplicable was happening in those tunnels, and Alira's primary concern was maintaining production revenue. I transmitted back, recommend evacuating station until situation is resolved. Personnel safety should be priority. Her reply was immediate and sharp. Personnel safety is balanced against sector stability. Evacuating Kellyan Station eliminates 15% of our operating budget and compromises our entire arrangement with the Bacta merchants. Find a way to contain the situation without disrupting production. That's an order. I had a choice then, a real choice, and I made the wrong one. I told the station manager to seal off the affected sections, K77 and the tunnels around it, and continue operations in the unaffected areas. I told the workers that the disappearances were being investigated, and that as long as they stayed away from the quarantine zones, they would be safe. I filed a report stating that the situation was contained and that production could continue with minimal disruption, and for 3 months it worked. Mining operations continued in the safe areas. The smuggling arrangement with the Bacta merchants proceeded as normal, and sector revenue remained stable. We lost no additional personnel because no one entered the quarantine sections. I told myself I'd made a pragmatic decision, that I'd balanced competing priorities, that maintaining sector stability was worth the risk of leaving those tunnels unexplored. Then the phenomena spread. It started in adjacent tunnels, then in sections of the station that had no connection to the original affected areas. Workers reported the same symptoms: voices in the walls, figures in the shadows, equipment malfunctions, and that pervasive sense of being watched. More people disappeared, vanishing from sections that should have been safe, and panic spread through the station like wildfire. Workers refused to report for shifts, some stealing shuttles and fleeing to other systems despite the criminal penalties for desertion. I returned to Kellyan Station with a larger security force and found the facility on the verge of complete collapse. Half the workforce had already fled. The remaining personnel were terrified and paranoid, and the phenomena had spread to nearly every section of the asteroid. The station manager was drinking himself unconscious every night. convinced that whatever haunted the tunnels was coming for him specifically. I tried everything I could think of. We brought in specialists, engineers to check for gas leaks or environmental hazards, medical personnel to test for toxins or psychological disorders, even a few minor force sensitives we'd quietly hired as consultants. Nothing explained what was happening. The phenomena defied analysis, defied logic, defied every attempt at scientific investigation. People kept disappearing and we kept finding no evidence of what took them. Finally, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I recommended complete evacuation and station closure. Whatever was in those asteroids was beyond our ability to understand or control, and continuing operations was condemning people to disappearance or death. Alira denied my recommendation. The sector couldn't afford to lose Kellyan Station's revenue, she explained, and closing it would mean exposing our entire financial arrangement to sector command scrutiny. We would find another solution, hire more personnel, offer premium pay to workers willing to risk the danger, but we would keep the station operational. I refused. For the first time in 3 years, I refused a direct order. I issued an evacuation order under my own authority, loaded every remaining worker onto transport shuttles, and sent them to Thyfera. Then I transmitted a full report to Sector Command on Bestinth 4, documenting everything, the disappearances, the phenomena, and Alira's orders to maintain production despite the danger. The response from Sector Command was not what I expected. Instead of commending my initiative or investigating the phenomena, they recalled me to Bestinth 4 for immediate disciplinary review. I was charged with exceeding my authority, making decisions reserved for senior administrators, and causing significant economic disruption through unauthorized evacuation. The hearing was perfunctory, a tribunal of 3 officers who clearly considered me an incompetent junior administrator who'd panicked and overreacted to what was probably just industrial accidents and worker hysteria. They stripped me of my position, placed a formal reprimand in my permanent record, and reassigned me to a data processing facility on Bestinth 4 itself, where I would spend my days filing other people's reports instead of conducting any analysis of my own. It was a humiliation, a demotion disguised as lateral transfer, and the tribunal made clear that any future deviation from protocol would result in my permanent dismissal from Imperial service. I accepted the punishment because I didn't know what else to do, because I was young and broken and convinced that I'd destroyed my career for nothing. Alira was not disciplined. She claimed I'd acted without authorization and against her explicit instructions, which was technically true, and she remained in charge of Epsilon 77's administration. But something had changed in me during those months on Kellyan Station. I'd seen something that couldn't be explained, couldn't be categorized, couldn't be controlled through Imperial administrative procedures, and more importantly, I'd seen how the Empire responded when confronted with phenomena it couldn't understand, not with curiosity or scientific investigation, but with denial and suppression, prioritizing economic considerations over truth or safety. I spent 6 months in that data processing facility, mechanically filing reports that other people had written, forbidden from conducting any independent analysis. But I had access to the Empire's administrative databases, and I started searching quietly for similar incidents across the galaxy, unexplained disappearances, reports of phenomena that defied explanation, facilities or regions where something incomprehensible had occurred. What I found terrified me. There were hundreds of incidents scattered across Imperial records, mining facilities where workers vanished, research stations that went silent without explanation, entire settlements that reported impossible occurrences before communication ceased. And in nearly every case, the Imperial response was the same: contain the situation, minimize economic disruption, classify the reports, and move on. If phenomena couldn't be explained through existing science or controlled through existing procedures, it was simply ignored or hidden. I compiled everything into a comprehensive analysis, a document showing that the Empire was systematically concealing evidence of unexplainable phenomena across the galaxy. I didn't know what these phenomena were: alien intelligences, force-related occurrences, spatial anomalies, or something else entirely. But I knew they existed, knew they posed dangers that the Empire refused to acknowledge. I tried to submit my analysis through official channels. It was rejected immediately, classified as speculative correlation without substantive evidence. And I was warned that continuing this line of inquiry would be considered grounds for dismissal. I tried to contact researchers at Imperial Science Division, hoping they might be interested in investigating. My messages were intercepted, and I was formally reprimanded for unauthorized communication regarding classified incidents. I was trapped in knowledge, understanding that the Empire was built on foundations of willful ignorance, that it maintained order by denying anything that didn't fit its doctrine of absolute control, and I was powerless to do anything except file reports and keep my mouth shut. Then Epsilon 77 went silent. It happened gradually, over 3 weeks. First, communications from Kellyan Station ceased entirely, not distress signals or reports of problems, just silence. Then Thyfera stopped transmitting routine administrative updates. Then the other systems in the sector went dark one by one, until all 14 inhabited worlds were completely non-responsive. Sector Command sent investigation teams, but they reported that hyperspace routes into Epsilon 77 had become unstable, that ships experienced severe navigational difficulties when attempting to enter the region, that several vessels had been lost trying to investigate. I watched the reports come in with growing horror, understanding what was happening even if no one else would admit it. The phenomena from Kellyan Station had spread, had consumed the entire sector, and the Empire's response was to quarantine the region and pretend it didn't exist. Official records listed Epsilon 77 as administratively reorganized pending resolution of temporary communication difficulties. In practice, the Empire drew a line around those 14 systems and stopped acknowledging they existed. No investigation teams, no rescue missions, no attempts to understand what had happened. Just silence and bureaucratic erasure. 60 billion people lived in Epsilon 77, 60 billion people who simply ceased to exist in Imperial records, their fates unknown and deliberately uninvestigated. And I was one of the few people who understood why it had happened, who knew that the Empire's corruption and willful ignorance had allowed something incomprehensible to spread unchecked until an entire sector was consumed. I couldn't stay silent. I compiled everything I knew: the original incidents on Kellyan Station, my investigation findings, the pattern of similar occurrences across the galaxy, and the Empire's systematic concealment. I encrypted it and transmitted it to rebel networks I'd identified through careful monitoring of Imperial intelligence reports. The rebellion received it, verified some of my data, and eventually published portions in their propaganda transmissions. They called it evidence of Imperial incompetence, proof that the Empire's vaunted order was a facade concealing catastrophic failures. They used it to recruit, to undermine confidence in Imperial governance, to show that the Emperor's grip on the galaxy was weaker than anyone realized. I was identified as the leak within days. ISB arrested me at my data processing terminal, and I was taken to an interrogation facility where they spent 3 weeks trying to extract information about my rebel contacts. I had no contacts to reveal. I'd transmitted the data anonymously and never communicated with any rebel operatives. Eventually, they seemed to believe me, or at least accept that I was a useful scapegoat, regardless of whether I was actually working with the rebellion. They charged me with treason, espionage, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The tribunal took less than an hour to convict me, and I was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Imperial Detention Center on Wobani, a prison moon where political criminals were sent to be forgotten. I spent 4 years on Wobani, working in labor camps and trying not to think about the 60 billion people in Epsilon 77 who disappeared while I processed reports and maintained the system that had killed them. I'd told myself I was maintaining order, serving the greater good, making pragmatic compromises, but I'd really been enabling evil, participating in a machine that consumed lives and truth with equal indifference. Then came the Battle of Endor, and news that the Emperor was dead, that the Empire was fragmenting, that the rebellion had become the new Republic. The guards at Wobani largely abandoned their posts, and in the chaos of the Empire's collapse, I and several hundred other prisoners simply walked away from the facility. We were free technically, though freedom meant little when I had no home, no career, no identity beyond former Imperial administrator who betrayed everything and accomplished nothing. I made my way back to Coruscant, hoping to reconnect with my father, hoping he might understand why I'd made the choices I had. I found him in the same apartment where I'd grown up, older and grayer, but still working logistics for what remained of Imperial supply operations. He listened to my story in silence, and when I finished, he looked at me with disappointment so profound it hurt worse than any interrogation on Wobani. "You betrayed your oath," he said quietly. "You abandoned your duty because you encountered something difficult, something you didn't understand. The Empire wasn't perfect, but it maintained order, and you helped destroy that order because you couldn't accept that pragmatic governance requires difficult compromises. The Empire let 60 billion people die rather than admit it couldn't control everything," I said. "The Empire made a calculated decision not to expend resources investigating a phenomenon that couldn't be understood or prevented," he corrected. "That's governance, that's leadership, making hard choices about resource allocation, accepting losses in some areas to preserve stability in others. You thought you were exposing corruption, but you were really just proving your own naivety." I left his apartment that day and never saw him again. I heard years later that he'd died during the New Republic's transition period, still believing in the Empire's vision even as that empire collapsed into warlordism and chaos. I tried to find survivors from Epsilon 77, hoping that some people had escaped before the sector went silent. I found 3, all of them miners from Kellyan Station who'd fled during the early disappearances. They confirmed that the phenomena had continued spreading, that by the time they escaped, it had reached Thyfera itself, that the last transmission spoke of voices in every building, figures in every shadow, a presence that seemed to be transforming the entire sector into something incomprehensible. The New Republic investigated eventually, sending several expeditions to explore what remained of Epsilon 77. The reports they published were heavily redacted, but what leaked through was horrifying. The systems were still there, the planet still existed, but something had fundamentally changed. Structures remained but were altered in ways that defied physics, arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive. No bodies were found, no evidence of what had happened to 60 billion people, just emptiness and wrongness that drove investigation teams to psychological breakdown. The New Republic eventually classified Epsilon 77 the same way the Empire had, drew a boundary, declared it off limits, and stopped asking questions. Whatever existed there was beyond current understanding, and no government wanted to risk resources or personnel trying to comprehend it. I've spent the last 20 years trying to warn people, trying to document similar phenomena across the galaxy, trying to convince anyone who will listen that there are things in this universe that governments can't control and shouldn't ignore. The New Republic mostly dismisses me as a traumatized ex-imperial administrator with conspiracy theories. Former imperial officers regard me as a traitor whose paranoia cost lives and undermined order. Neither side understands that the truth is worse than corruption or incompetence. The galaxy contains phenomena that transcend human comprehension, and we've built civilizations that refuse to acknowledge anything beyond their control. The Empire's great failure wasn't cruelty or tyranny. It was the arrogance of believing that order and procedure could contain everything, that any problem could be solved through sufficient application of force and bureaucracy. I helped maintain that arrogance. I processed reports that concealed truth, participated in systems that prioritized revenue over safety, chose comfort and career over difficult questions. And when I finally encountered something that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be contained through administrative procedure, my attempt to expose it accomplished nothing except my own destruction. 60 billion people in Epsilon 77 are gone, not dead, gone, transformed into something or transported somewhere or simply erased from reality. I don't know which, and neither does anyone else, because both the Empire and the New Republic have decided that not knowing is safer than investigating. I'm dying now. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months, some consequence of exposure to whatever toxins or radiation existed on Wobani. I'm recording this because someone needs to understand what happened, needs to know that the sector the Empire quietly abandoned wasn't abandoned because of rebellion or economic failure. It was abandoned because something incomprehensible consumed it, and the Empire's response to incomprehensibility was erasure. We tell ourselves that civilization is about order, about control, about maintaining stability through governance and law. But really, civilization is about choosing what we acknowledge and what we ignore, what we investigate and what we classify, what truths we can face and what truths we pretend don't exist. Epsilon 77 existed. 60 billion people lived there. Something took them, and 2 galactic governments decided that acknowledging it was more dangerous than forgetting it. I spent my life serving order, and order taught me that truth is less important than stability, that knowledge is less valuable than control, that understanding is less necessary than the comfortable illusion that someone is in charge. The galaxy is vast and ancient, and we understand almost nothing about it. But we've built empires and republics that pretend omniscience, that claim authority over territories they can barely comprehend, that maintain order through the systematic suppression of anything that contradicts their doctrine of control. I don't know what happened in Epsilon 77. I don't know what lives in those asteroids, what whispers in those tunnels, what transformed 14 systems into something beyond human comprehension. But I know that it exists, that it's probably not unique, and that our civilizations will continue sacrificing truth to maintain the illusion that we understand and control our universe. That's the legacy I'm leaving, not solutions or answers, just the documentation of a question that no one wants to ask. What happens when the galaxy contains things that transcend our ability to govern, and we choose denial over investigation? Epsilon 77 was the Empire's answer. Erasure, silence, the quiet abandonment of anything that couldn't be controlled. I participated in that abandonment. I helped create the conditions that allowed it. And all I can do now is record the truth and hope that someday someone will have the courage to actually investigate instead of just drawing new boundaries around the incomprehensible. The sector the Empire quietly abandoned is still there, still waiting, still unexplained, and somewhere in the galaxy there are probably others, Other regions where something incomprehensible has occurred, and governments have chosen to look away rather than understand. That's the truth they don't want recorded. That's the reality that doesn't fit on official reports. I'm dying, and the truth dies with me unless someone remembers. Order is a choice, not a natural state. Civilization is maintained through constant decisions about what to acknowledge and what to suppress. And sometimes the cost of maintaining order is abandoning everything that makes order meaningful: truth, justice, the 60 billion lives that existed before we decided they were too complicated to acknowledge. The truth. I was a coward who chose comfort over conscience, who processed reports while people died, who served systems that prioritized revenue over safety. Epsilon 77 fell because I didn't act soon enough, because I believed pragmatic compromise was wisdom, because I convinced myself that order justified any sacrifice. 60 billion people are gone, not killed cleanly, but transformed into something incomprehensible that two governments refuse to investigate. I leaked the truth, hoping to force accountability. But governments don't acknowledge what they can't control. They just erase it. The Empire abandoned Epsilon 77 without explanation, because explanation would require admitting limits to their power. The New Republic does the same now. I spent my life serving order, learning too late that order is often just organized denial, systematic refusal to see what contradicts authority's omniscience. I can't bring back the disappeared, can't undo my complicity, can only record that they existed, that something took them, and that we chose ignorance over understanding because understanding was too expensive, too dangerous, too disruptive to the comfortable lie that someone is in control.